Welcome to Whispered Empires, where history's shadows reveal their secrets in the quiet hours. Tonight, we journey through time to uncover the enigmatic story of the Jewish people, a tale of resilience, mystery, and profound cultural legacy that spans millennia. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and activate the bell notification to join us on future journeys into history's whispered truths. In the soft glow of desert sunlight, archaeologists gather around a peculiar discovery: ancient inscriptions on weathered stone, partially obscured by the shifting sands of time. Their hands, steady with practiced precision, brush away centuries of dust, revealing characters in an ancient script. Hebrew letters, carved by hands that lived and breathed over 3,000 years ago. This is where our journey begins, not with certainty, but with questions etched in stone. The origins of the Jewish people shimmer like a mirage in the distant past, elusive, complex, yet undeniably present. Conventional history tells us their story begins approximately 4,000 years ago, with a man named Abraham who, according to biblical tradition, received a divine call to leave his home in Mesopotamia. Yet beneath this narrative lies a deeper mystery. What forces shaped the emergence of a people whose influence on human history would prove so profound? Abraham's journey from Ur of the Chaldees to Canaan marks the first documented migration in Jewish history. The biblical account describes a man who broke with the polytheistic traditions of his ancestors, embracing the radical concept of monotheism, belief in a single, all-powerful deity who could not be represented in physical form. This revolutionary theological shift would become the foundation of not just Judaism, but eventually Christianity and Islam as well. While religious texts provide one narrative thread, archaeology offers another perspective on these ancient origins. In climate-controlled laboratories, researchers examine fragments of pottery, ancient genetic material, and linguistic patterns that suggest complex interactions between early Hebrew peoples and surrounding civilizations. The evidence points to a gradual crystallization of identity rather than a sudden emergence, a slow coalescence of tribes, beliefs, and practices into what would eventually become known as Judaism. The patriarchal narratives, stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob function as both historical account and spiritual metaphor. These desert wanderers, described in Genesis as shepherds and tribal leaders, established covenantal relationships with their God that would define Jewish identity for millennia to come. Yet even here, in these foundational stories, we find curious anomalies that hint at forgotten connections and lost contexts. Consider the enigmatic encounter at Bethel, where Jacob dreams of a ladder stretching between earth and heaven. The text describes his awakening with the words, "Surely God is in this place, and I did not know it." Archaeological excavations reveal that Bethel was indeed an ancient cultic site long before Jacob's time. Was this narrative preserving a memory of sacred spaces that predated the Hebrew people themselves? The question hangs in the still desert air, unanswered. The transition from wandering patriarchs to the formation of a distinct people accelerates with the Egyptian sojourn. According to biblical chronology, Abraham's descendants migrated to Egypt during a famine, eventually becoming enslaved there for generations. While direct archaeological evidence of the Israelite presence in Egypt remains elusive, cultural memories of displacement and bondage became central to Jewish identity. In the shadowy corridors of Egyptology, researchers continue to debate the historical foundation of the Exodus narrative. Some point to the Hyksos expulsion in the 16th century BCE, while others examine evidence of Semitic peoples in Egypt during the New Kingdom period. The absence of explicit Egyptian records mentioning an Israelite exodus is notable, though perhaps unsurprising, as ancient powers rarely documented their defeats or the escape of subjugated peoples. More compelling than disputed historical details is the profound psychological impact of the Exodus narrative. This story of liberation from bondage became the central metaphor of Jewish consciousness, a template for understanding oppression and freedom that would be revisited countless times throughout the centuries. The annual Passover celebration ensures that each generation personally identifies with this foundational journey from slavery to freedom. At the heart of the Exodus story stands the enigmatic figure of Moses, Prince of Egypt turned liberator, lawgiver, and prophet. According to tradition, it was through Moses that the Jewish people received their defining legal code, the Torah, during their desert wanderings. The revelation at Mount Sinai represents the pivotal moment when a collection of tribes coalesced into a people bound by covenant and law. The Torah itself presents a fascinating paradox, a document simultaneously ancient and timeless. Its 5 books contain narrative history, legal codes, genealogies, and poetry, creating a comprehensive worldview that would sustain Jewish identity through centuries of upheaval. Scholars continue to debate its composition, with theories ranging from divine revelation to complex evolutionary development over centuries of editorial work. The conquest of Canaan marks the transition from nomadic existence to territorial settlement. Archaeological evidence presents a complex picture of this period, suggesting a process more gradual and multifaceted than the dramatic military campaign described in the Book of Joshua. Settlement patterns indicate a combination of migration, cultural assimilation, and internal social revolution rather than a straightforward conquest. In silent tells scattered across the landscapes of Israel and Jordan, evidence of early Israelite settlements emerges from the earth. 4-room houses, distinctive pottery lacking pig bones, and the absence of iconic representations all point to communities practicing early forms of what would become Judaism. These material remains speak to us across millennia, whispers of daily life, ritual practices, and communal identity taking root in the Promised Land. The period of the Judges represents an enigmatic interlude, a time without centralized authority when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This chaotic era saw the emergence of charismatic leaders who rallied tribes against external threats, yet failed to establish lasting political structures. Behind these biblical narratives, archaeologists detect evidence of scattered settlements gradually developing shared cultural and religious practices. The emergence of monarchy transformed Israelite society. Under Kings Saul, David, and Solomon, disparate tribes united into a significant regional power. David's conquest of Jerusalem around 1000 BCE and Solomon's construction of the First Temple created a political and religious center that would define Jewish consciousness even long after its physical destruction. Yet these golden ages prove surprisingly elusive in the archaeological record, raising questions about the scale and nature of the early kingdom. The opulent court of Solomon, described in biblical texts as a wonder of the ancient world, leaves tantalizingly few material traces. Did later authors exaggerate the grandeur of this early kingdom, or have the remains simply eluded discovery? In hushed museum storerooms, researchers examine seal impressions, architectural fragments, and administrative texts that offer glimpses of state formation and bureaucratic development during this pivotal era. After Solomon's death, the united monarchy fractured into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This division, seemingly a mere political rupture, would have profound consequences for Jewish history. The northern kingdom, with its capital at Samaria, developed distinctive religious practices that diverged from Jerusalem-centered worship. Archaeological excavations at northern cult sites reveal complex religious syncretism that challenges simplistic views of Israelite monotheism. The destruction of the northern kingdom by Assyria in 722 BCE stands as one of history's great disappearing acts. The 10 northern tribes, forcibly relocated according to Assyrian imperial policy, fade from the historical record, becoming the legendary lost tribes of Israel. Their descendants may have assimilated into surrounding populations, though claims of lost tribe heritage have emerged from Ethiopia to Japan, from Afghanistan to Native American communities. The southern kingdom of Judah, centered around Jerusalem, survived the Assyrian onslaught but faced its own existential threat from Babylonia. In 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar's forces breached Jerusalem's walls, destroyed Solomon's temple, and exiled the elite to Babylonia. In the layers of ash and destruction visible at archaeological sites across Judah, we find mute testimony to this catastrophe that nearly ended the Jewish story. The Babylonian exile represents a crucial turning point, the moment when Judaism might have disappeared but instead underwent profound transformation. In the foreign soil of Mesopotamia, exiled Judeans developed new religious practices centered on scripture, prayer, and communal gathering rather than temple sacrifice. These innovations would allow Judaism to survive the loss of its geographic center and eventually evolve into a portable faith. The return from exile, permitted by Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great around 538 BCE, did not involve all exiled Judeans. Many remained in Babylonia, establishing the first significant Jewish diaspora community. Those who did return faced the monumental task of rebuilding Jerusalem and constructing a second temple. This period saw the editing and canonization of many biblical texts, as the community sought to preserve its traditions and redefine its identity after catastrophe. The Persian period remains somewhat shrouded in historical uncertainty. Biblical books like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther provide narrative glimpses of Jewish life under Persian rule, but archaeological evidence is relatively sparse. What does seem clear is that this era saw the emergence of Judaism as we would begin to recognize it today, centered around scripture, featuring synagogue worship alongside the temple cult, and increasingly defined by distinctive practices like Sabbath observance and dietary laws. Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire in the late 4th century BCE brought the Jewish world into contact with Hellenistic civilization. Greek language, philosophy, athletics, and aesthetics penetrated Jewish society, creating new cultural tensions and possibilities. Inscriptions, architecture, and artifacts from this period reveal a complex process of cultural negotiation as Jews adopted aspects of Greek culture while maintaining their distinctive religious identity. The Maccabean revolt of the 2nd century BCE represents one dramatic response to Hellenistic influence. When Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV attempted to suppress Jewish religious practices and installed pagan worship in the temple, a family of priests led a successful guerrilla campaign to restore traditional worship. The festival of Hanukkah commemorates their victory and the temple's rededication, a story of resistance to cultural assimilation that would resonate throughout later Jewish history. The Hasmonean dynasty that emerged from the Maccabean revolt established an independent Jewish state that lasted nearly a century. This kingdom gradually expanded its borders and forcibly converted neighboring peoples to Judaism. Paradoxically, the Hasmonean rulers themselves adopted many Hellenistic royal customs, demonstrating the complex cultural synthesis that characterized this era. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a society engaged in both religious purification and cultural adaptation. Roman involvement in Judean affairs began as mediation between Hasmonean rivals but escalated to outright conquest. Pompey's forces took Jerusalem in 63 BCE, beginning a complex and ultimately tragic relationship between Rome and the Jewish people. The Romans initially ruled through client kings like Herod the Great, whose massive building projects, including the expansion of the Second Temple, transformed the physical landscape of Judea. Herod's temple stood as a wonder of the ancient world, a massive complex of gleaming limestone rising above Jerusalem. Archaeological excavations continue to uncover elements of this monumental structure, from massive foundation stones to intricate decorative elements. Yet this architectural marvel would stand for less than a century before meeting a violent end during the First Jewish-Roman War. The decades leading to the Great Revolt of 66 to 73 CE saw increasing tensions between Roman authorities and the Jewish population. Religious zealots, apocalyptic preachers, and political revolutionaries offered competing visions of resistance. Among these turbulent currents emerged early Christianity, initially a Jewish sectarian movement centered around the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, claiming messianic fulfillment yet ultimately developing into a separate religion. The destruction of the Second Temple by Roman forces in 70 CE represents a pivotal catastrophe in Jewish history. After a lengthy siege of Jerusalem, Roman legions breached the city walls, slaughtered much of the population, and set fire to the temple. The sacred center of Jewish religious life was reduced to rubble, with only the massive Western Wall remaining as a testament to its former glory. This cataclysm could have ended Judaism. Instead, it forced a radical reimagining of religious practice. In the aftermath of destruction, a group of scholars gathered at Yavne under the leadership of Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. This assembly began the monumental process of reconstructing Judaism without its temple. Prayer would replace sacrifice, study would become a form of worship, and the home would serve as a small sanctuary. The rabbis who emerged from this period would transform Judaism from a temple-centered religion to a tradition that could survive and thrive in diaspora. The Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE marked the final attempt at Jewish military resistance against Rome. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whom some recognized as the Messiah, Jewish fighters established an independent state that lasted 3 years before being crushed by Roman legions. The aftermath was devastating. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman colony forbidden to Jews. Judea was renamed Palestine in an attempt to erase Jewish connection to the land, and hundreds of thousands were killed or enslaved. In the caves of the Judean desert, evidence of these final resistors still emerges. Letters written by Bar Kokhba himself, coins proclaiming year one of the redemption of Israel, and everyday objects hastily hidden by refugees. Perhaps most remarkable are the Cave of Letters finds, personal documents, keys to abandoned homes, and ritual objects carried by families fleeing Roman repression. These poignant remains put human faces on an ancient catastrophe. The centuries following the Bar Kokhba disaster saw the center of Jewish life shift decisively to the diaspora. Major communities flourished in Babylonia, modern Iraq, and gradually spread throughout the Mediterranean basin. In these dispersed communities, the rabbinic Judaism that had begun at Yavne continued to develop through intense textual study, legal interpretation, and the gradual compilation of the Talmud, a vast compendium of law, ethics, folklore, and theology. The Jerusalem Talmud and the more extensive Babylonian Talmud represent monumental achievements of collective intellectual effort. These complex texts record centuries of rabbinic debates, preserving minority opinions alongside majority rulings, and exploring everything from agricultural regulations to mystical cosmology. The Talmudic process of questioning, analysis, and creative interpretation established patterns of thought that would characterize Jewish intellectual life for centuries to come. The rise of Christianity as Rome's imperial religion in the 4th century dramatically altered the status of Judaism. Once legally recognized as an ancestral tradition, Judaism now became increasingly marginalized. Christian theology often cast Jews as stubborn rejectors of religious truth, while imperial legislation gradually restricted Jewish rights and opportunities. Despite these growing pressures, Jewish communities maintained their traditions and developed strategies for surviving in increasingly hostile environments. The Arab conquests of the 7th century brought most of the Jewish world under Islamic rule. Initially, this represented an improvement in conditions for many Jewish communities. Islam classified Jews as people of the book, granting them protected status as dhimmis with religious autonomy, though subject to various restrictions and special taxation. Under early Islamic governance, Jewish cultural and intellectual life flourished in centers like Baghdad and Cordoba. The medieval period saw the emergence of distinct Jewish cultural spheres. Sephardic Jews under Islamic rule developed traditions different from those of Ashkenazi Jews in Christian Europe. These communities maintained connections through trade, scholarly correspondence, and religious jurisprudence, yet gradually developed distinctive liturgies, cuisines, religious customs, and literary traditions that reflected their different host cultures. Islamic Spain represents a particularly vibrant chapter in Jewish history. Despite legal restrictions and occasional persecution, Jewish culture flourished during this golden age. Figures like poet-philosopher Solomon ibn Gabirol, religious thinker Moses Maimonides, and poet Judah Halevi produced masterworks of literature, philosophy, and religious thought. Their writings, often composed in Judeo-Arabic, reflect the complex cultural synthesis that characterized this cosmopolitan society. The Cairo Geniza provides an extraordinary window into medieval Jewish life. In the storeroom of Cairo's Ben Ezra synagogue, hundreds of thousands of documents accumulated over nearly a millennium, everything from sacred texts to shopping lists, marriage contracts to medical prescriptions, poetry to business correspondence. Discovered by scholars in the late 19th century, this accidental archive reveals the everyday reality of Jewish existence in the Islamic world. For Ashkenazi Jews in medieval Christian Europe, life oscillated between periods of relative stability and outbursts of persecution. Jewish communities clustered in towns and cities, often restricted to specific quarters and excluded from many occupations. They developed autonomous communal institutions governed by local councils, kahals, and rabbinic courts, creating a society within society that preserved distinctive religious practices, language, and culture. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, marked a dark turning point for European Jews. As Crusader armies mobilized to liberate Jerusalem, some turned against Jewish communities along the Rhine River, perpetrating the first major massacres of Jews in European history. These attacks established a pattern of violence that would recur with disturbing frequency in medieval Europe, often connected to religious fervor, economic resentment, or the spread of conspiracy theories. Medieval anti-Jewish hostility manifested in accusations of ritual murder, desecration of the communion host, and well poisoning. These blood libels, though repeatedly denounced by popes and refuted by investigations, persisted for centuries and led to judicial murders and mob violence. Behind these specific accusations lay deeper theological antipathy, the belief that Jews were cursed for rejecting Christ and conspired against Christian society. Despite persecution, medieval Jewish intellectual life remained remarkably vibrant. The Tosophists of France and Germany produced meticulous Talmudic commentaries. Philosophers engaged with Aristotelian thought while defending religious tradition. Mystical movements developed new understandings of divine nature and human spiritual potential. Poetry, biblical interpretation, legal codes, and scientific works flowed from Jewish communities that maintained intellectual vitality even under extreme pressure. The development of Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition, reached its medieval apex with the appearance of the Zohar in 13th century Spain. This cryptic, poetic text portrays the divine realm as a dynamic system of 10 emanations, Sphirot, and interprets scripture as containing encoded cosmic secrets. Though attributed to a 2nd century sage, modern scholarship suggests the Zohar was largely composed by Moses de Leon. Regardless of its origins, this text would profoundly influence Jewish spiritual life for centuries. The intensification of persecution in late medieval Europe led to waves of Jewish expulsion from England, 1290, France, repeatedly between 1306 and 1394, and most dramatically from Spain, 1492, and Portugal, 1497. The Spanish expulsion ended one of history's most productive Jewish communities and forced approximately 100,000 Jews to choose between conversion, exile, or death. Many who converted, conversos, continued practicing Judaism secretly, creating a subculture of crypto-Judaism that would persist for generations. The Ottoman Empire welcomed many Sephardic exiles from the Iberian Peninsula, allowing them to rebuild their communities in cities like Salonika, Constantinople, and Safed. Sultan Bayezid II reportedly remarked that the Spanish monarch had impoverished his own country while enriching the Ottoman domains by expelling such talented subjects. Indeed, Sephardic immigrants contributed significantly to Ottoman commerce, medicine, diplomacy, and manufacturing. The 16th century town of Safed in the Galilee became an extraordinary center of Jewish mysticism and legal scholarship. Kabbalists like Isaac Luria developed complex cosmological systems explaining divine contraction, Tzimtzum, cosmic repair, Tikkun, and the soul's journey. Meanwhile, legal scholar Joseph Caro composed the Shulchan Aruch, a comprehensive code that would become the standard reference for Jewish practice. This remote mountain town briefly served as a laboratory for religious innovation that would influence Judaism worldwide. The Protestant Reformation changed Christian-Jewish relations in complex ways. Early Protestant leaders like Martin Luther initially hoped Jews would convert once Catholic corruption was removed. When this failed to occur, some became even more virulently anti-Jewish than their Catholic predecessors. Yet the Reformation's emphasis on biblical text and Hebrew language gradually led to increased Christian scholarly interest in Judaism and Jewish sources. The Jewish mystical movements that had begun in medieval Spain found new expression in 17th century Messianic fervor. The most dramatic episode centered around Sabbatai Zevi, who proclaimed himself Messiah in 1665, attracting tens of thousands of followers across the Jewish world. His subsequent conversion to Islam under Ottoman pressure created profound theological crisis. Some followers converted with him, creating the Donma community. Others developed complex theological justifications for his apparent betrayal. Eastern Europe gradually became home to the world's largest Jewish population. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jewish communities obtained significant autonomy through the Council of Four Lands, which functioned as a representative body and court system. Jewish life centered around the shtetl, small towns where Jews often constituted a substantial portion of the population, working as craftsmen, merchants, and innkeepers while maintaining vibrant religious and cultural traditions. The Hasidic movement emerged in 18th century Eastern Europe as a populist religious revival. Founded by Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, Hasidism emphasized emotional connection to God through prayer, storytelling, song, and dance. It democratized mystical concepts previously restricted to scholarly elites and created a new leadership model in the charismatic tzaddik or rebbe. Despite fierce opposition from traditional rabbis, mitnagdim, the movement spread rapidly across Eastern Europe. While Hasidism turned inward to spiritual revival, the Enlightenment Haskalah movement looked outward toward integration with modern European culture. Figures like philosopher Moses Mendelssohn advocated for secular education, cultural adaptation, and political emancipation while maintaining Jewish religious identity. These maskilim, enlightened ones, promoted Hebrew literature, scientific knowledge, and educational reform while critiquing what they saw as outdated or superstitious elements of traditional Jewish life. The French Revolution initiated the process of Jewish political emancipation in Europe. In 1791, France became the first European country to grant Jews full citizenship rights. Napoleon spread this emancipation to territories under French control, demolishing ghetto walls and ending centuries of legal discrimination. However, this newfound equality came with implicit expectations of cultural assimilation and religious reform that created new tensions within Jewish communities. The 19th century witnessed dramatic diversification within Judaism. Reform Judaism emerged in Germany, advocating modernization of worship, theology, and practice. Orthodox Judaism developed as a conscious traditionalist response to reform efforts. Conservative, Masorti, Judaism later sought a middle path, accepting modern scholarship while maintaining greater ritual commitment. These denominational divisions, still visible today, reflect different responses to the fundamental question of how an ancient tradition should engage with modernity. Despite legal emancipation, 19th century European antisemitism persisted and evolved. Traditional religious antipathy was gradually supplemented or replaced by racial theories that defined Jewishness as an immutable biological category rather than a religious identity that could be changed through conversion. Pseudoscientific works portrayed Jews as racially distinct and inherently harmful to European societies. These toxic ideas would bear their deadliest fruit in the 20th century. The Damascus Affair of 1840, a blood libel accusation that led to the torture and death of Jews in Syria, mobilized international Jewish advocacy in unprecedented ways. Prominent Western Jews like Moses Montefiore and Adolphe Cremuse intervened diplomatically to protect their co-religionists. This incident helped crystallize modern Jewish communal consciousness, demonstrating both the persistent dangers facing Jews worldwide and the potential power of coordinated action on their behalf. Zionism emerged in the late 19th century as a revolutionary response to European antisemitism. While religious Jews had always maintained spiritual connection to the land of Israel, modern Zionism advocated for practical settlement and eventual political sovereignty. Theodor Herzl, catalyzed by the antisemitism he witnessed during the Dreyfus Affair in France, convened the First Zionist Congress in 1897, establishing an organized movement to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Early Zionist pioneers, Kalutzim, established agricultural settlements in Ottoman and later British-controlled Palestine. These idealistic immigrants drained swamps, planted orchards, and established collective farms, kibbutzim, while reviving Hebrew as a spoken language. They faced significant challenges: difficult climate, disease, economic hardship, and increasingly hostile relations with the local Arab population, which perceived Jewish immigration as a colonial threat. The collapse of the Russian Empire during World War I and the subsequent Civil War unleashed unprecedented violence against Jewish communities. Pogroms conducted by various military factions killed tens of thousands of Jews in Ukraine and Belarus between 1918 and 1921. While the early Soviet regime officially opposed antisemitism and abolished Tsarist restrictions, It also repressed Jewish religious and Zionist activities as part of its broader campaign against religion and nationalism. The interwar period saw American Judaism flourish as immigration restrictions ended the mass influx from Eastern Europe. Second-generation immigrants moved from urban ethnic enclaves to more diverse neighborhoods and entered mainstream professions. Jewish cultural expressions, from Hollywood films to Broadway shows, literature to comedy, became integral parts of American culture. New institutional forms emerged, including the synagogue center, combining worship with educational and social functions. Interwar Poland contained Europe's largest Jewish population, approximately 3.3 million people with vibrant and diverse cultural expressions. Yiddish theater, literature, and journalism flourished alongside Hebrew education, religious academies, and political movements ranging from Orthodox to Socialist Bundist to Zionist. This cultural renaissance would be almost completely extinguished in the Holocaust that followed. Nazi Germany's rise to power in 1933 initiated the systematic persecution of European Jewry. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped German Jews of citizenship and prohibited intermarriage. Kristallnacht in 1938 demonstrated the regime's willingness to use violence and destruction. As Germany conquered territory in World War II, persecution escalated to mass murder, first through shooting operations in the East, then through the construction of death camps implementing industrial-scale killing. The Holocaust, Shoah, represents the most extreme manifestation of anti-Semitism in history, an attempt to eliminate the Jewish people entirely. Approximately 6 million Jews perished, representing roughly 2/3 of European Jewry and 1/3 of the world's Jewish population. Beyond these devastating statistics lie millions of individual stories of loss, suffering, resistance, and occasionally survival against overwhelming odds. Jewish resistance during the Holocaust took many forms. Armed uprisings occurred in ghettos like Warsaw and death camps like Sobibor and Treblinka. Partisan groups operated in forests across Eastern Europe. Smuggling rings sustained ghetto residents and rescued children. Cultural and spiritual resistance, maintaining human dignity through education, religious observance, artistic expression, and documentation, preserved humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The establishment of Israel in 1948 represented both the fulfillment of Zionist aspirations and a response to the Holocaust's devastation. However, the declaration of independence was immediately followed by invasion from surrounding Arab states and the displacement of approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs in what Palestinians call the Nakba catastrophe. This founding trauma established patterns of conflict that continue to shape Israeli society and Middle Eastern politics. The ingathering of Jewish communities from across the diaspora transformed Israeli society in the decades following independence. Holocaust survivors from Europe, Jews from Muslim countries fleeing nationalism and anti-Semitism, later immigrants from Ethiopia and the former Soviet Union, all brought distinctive traditions, languages, and expectations. This diversity created social tensions but also cultural richness within a society attempting to forge unified national identity from disparate elements. American Judaism in the post-war period experienced unprecedented growth and acceptance. Suburbanization generated synagogue building booms, while higher education and professional advancement integrated Jews into mainstream society. The Six-Day War in 1967 catalyzed increased identification with Israel, while growing intermarriage rates prompted concerns about continuity. New spiritual movements, feminist innovations, and cultural expressions reflected American Jewry's confidence and creativity. The Soviet Jewry movement of the 1970s and 1980s mobilized international advocacy on behalf of Jews prevented from emigrating or practicing their religion. This campaign, combining grassroots activism with high-level diplomacy, ultimately enabled over 1 million Soviet Jews to leave for Israel and the West. Their exodus effectively ended centuries of Jewish civilization in Russia and Ukraine while injecting new demographic and intellectual energy into Israeli society. Contemporary Jewish life reflects both unprecedented security and prosperity in places like North America and new uncertainties in Europe, where anti-Semitism has resurged in recent decades. Israel has developed into a regional military and economic power, yet continues to face existential threats and internal divisions over its relationship with the Palestinians. The role of religion in public life, and the balance between security and democratic values. The modern Jewish world presents paradoxes and contradictions. Religious observance flourishes in some communities while secular identity prevails in others. Israel's technological innovation contrasts with the poverty of its ultra-Orthodox sector. American Jewish institutional affiliation declines while interest in Jewish spirituality and culture remains robust. These tensions reflect the complex challenges of maintaining distinctive identity within open societies and negotiating between tradition and change. Throughout this historical journey, certain themes emerge consistently: the creative tension between tradition and innovation, the balance between integration and distinctiveness, the maintenance of collective memory across generations, the development of resilience mechanisms that transform catastrophe into renewal. These patterns reveal a culture remarkably adaptive yet committed to continuity, an ancient people continuously reimagining itself while honoring its foundational narratives. In our search for the origins of the Hebrew people, we must return to those ancient deserts where our story began. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Israelites emerged primarily from indigenous Canaanite populations rather than arriving as complete outsiders. Settlement patterns indicate a gradual social transformation within Canaan during the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE. The biblical Exodus narrative may preserve memories of smaller-scale migrations integrated into a powerful national origin story. The ancient Israelites distinguished themselves from surrounding Canaanite cultures not through complete separation but through gradual differentiation. Archaeological evidence shows distinctive practices emerging: the absence of pig bones in food remains, the lack of human or divine figurines in households, and settlement patterns favoring highlands rather than coastal plains. These material differences suggest the slow crystallization of a distinct cultural identity. Hebrew monotheism likely evolved gradually rather than appearing fully formed. Early biblical texts hint at monolatry, the worship of one God while acknowledging others' existence, rather than absolute monotheism. Female figurines found in Israelite households suggest folk religious practices incorporating goddess worship persisted alongside official Yahwism. The prophetic tradition repeatedly condemned such backsliding, indicating tension between theological ideals and popular practice. The mysterious Ark of the Covenant represents one of history's most enduring religious enigmas. Described in the Bible as a gold-plated wooden chest containing the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, the Ark reportedly possessed supernatural properties and served as the focal point of early Israelite worship. Its disappearance, perhaps during the Babylonian conquest, has spawned centuries of speculation, legend, and fruitless searches from Ethiopia to the caves beneath Jerusalem's Temple Mount. After the Babylonian exile, Jewish communities increasingly oriented themselves around written texts rather than sacred places. This textual emphasis, studying, copying, and interpreting scripture, created a portable religious framework that could survive geographic displacement. The synagogue emerged as an institution for communal prayer and study, eventually developing architectural forms that incorporated symbolic references to the lost temple while adapting to local building traditions. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls beginning in 1947 revolutionized our understanding of ancient Judaism. These manuscripts, hidden in Qumran caves around 68 CE, include biblical texts predating other surviving copies by nearly a millennium, along with previously unknown works. The scrolls reveal a Judaism more diverse than previously understood, with competing interpretations of religious law, messianic expectations, and ritual practices existing before the emergence of rabbinic orthodoxy. The Roman-era synagogue at Dur Europos in Syria offers another window into early Judaism's complexity. Its walls feature vivid frescoes depicting biblical scenes, seemingly contradicting assumptions about ancient Jewish prohibitions on figurative art. These paintings demonstrate how diaspora communities navigated between maintaining distinctive traditions and adopting elements from surrounding cultures, a pattern that would characterize much of subsequent Jewish history. The development of Jewish prayer involved transformation of temple rituals into verbal formulations that could be performed anywhere. The standardized Amidah prayer emerged as a substitute for sacrificial offerings, while psalms originally sung by temple choirs became core elements of communal worship. This process of ritualization created structures of time and practice that would unify dispersed communities despite geographic separation and cultural differences. Jewish dietary practices, kashrut, evolved from biblical prohibitions into elaborate systems governing food preparation and consumption. These restrictions served multiple functions: maintaining boundary markers with surrounding populations, instilling mindfulness in daily activities, and creating community through shared practices. While often misconstrued as health measures, these regulations primarily expressed religious commitments and reinforced collective identity across diverse environments. The rabbinic sages of the Mishnaic and Talmudic periods, 70 to 500 CE, performed an extraordinary feat of cultural preservation and adaptation. Without central authority, military power, or governmental support, they reconstructed Judaism around textual study, legal reasoning, and communal self-governance. Their intellectual methodology, questioning assumptions, examining implications, respecting minority viewpoints, seeking consensus, created a tradition valuing critical thinking alongside reverence for tradition. The Gaonic period, 589-1038 CE, centered in Babylonia, saw the establishment of rabbinic academies whose leaders, geonim, issued legal responses to questions from Jewish communities across the diaspora. This system allowed for local autonomy while maintaining overall unity of practice. The most famous Jain, Sadia ben Joseph, 882 to 942 CE, defended rabbinic Judaism against Karaite literalists while integrating Greek philosophical concepts with traditional belief, exemplifying Judaism's capacity for synthesis. Medieval Jewish philosophy reached its apex with Moses Maimonides, 1138 to 1204, whose masterwork, Guide for the Perplexed, attempted to reconcile Aristotelian rationalism with biblical faith. Maimonides argued that Scripture often uses allegory and metaphor when discussing divine attributes, as God's true nature transcends human comprehension. His rationalist approach generated controversy in his time but established precedents for integrating secular knowledge with religious tradition. The Cairo Geniza reveals not only religious texts but extensive documentation of commercial networks connecting medieval Jewish communities across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean worlds. Jewish merchants operated within a framework of trust based on family connections, shared legal standards, and communal reputation mechanisms. Letters traveled between communities separated by thousands of miles, maintaining cultural connections despite physical distance. The Jewish quarter, Juderia in Spain, Ghetto in Italy, Mela in Morocco, represents a physical manifestation of medieval Jewish legal status, neither fully included nor completely excluded from the surrounding society. These neighborhoods combined external restrictions with internal autonomy, creating spaces where distinctive culture could flourish while facilitating economic and intellectual exchange with the broader society. Their architectural remains, synagogues, ritual baths, inscriptions, offer tangible connections to vanished communities. Medieval Jewish mysticism developed sophisticated psychological insights alongside cosmic speculations. Kabbalistic texts describe the Sefirot not only as attributes of God but as aspects of human consciousness. Meditative practices, letter permutations, and visualization techniques aim to achieve spiritual states transcending ordinary awareness. These esoteric traditions, initially restricted to elite practitioners, eventually permeated broader Jewish culture through adapted prayers, customs, and ethical teachings. The traumatic Spanish expulsion of 1492 scattered Sephardic Jews across North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually the Americas. In their new homes, these communities maintained distinctive liturgies, melodies, cuisines, and even language, continuing to speak Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. For centuries, their rabbis developed legal approaches that often showed greater flexibility than their Ashkenazic counterparts, perhaps reflecting the community's experience of radical dislocation. The printing revolution transformed Jewish intellectual life. The first Hebrew books were printed in the 1470s, and by the 16th century, standardized editions of the Bible, Talmud, and legal codes became widely available. This technology democratized learning, expanded women's access to texts through Yiddish translations, and created greater uniformity of practice across far-flung communities. Printed books also preserved works that might otherwise have vanished during periods of persecution and displacement. The Ghetto of Venice, established in 1516, gave its name to segregated Jewish quarters throughout Europe. Within these confined spaces, distinctive architectural adaptations emerged: multi-story buildings, hidden synagogues disguised from exterior view, densely packed housing. Despite physical restrictions, these communities developed rich cultural lives, producing scholars, musicians, physicians, and entrepreneurs who navigated between Jewish and Christian worlds as cultural intermediaries. Jewish women's history emerges primarily through indirect sources, as male authors dominated most surviving texts. Yet evidence indicates that women maintained significant religious and economic roles despite formal exclusion from institutional leadership and advanced textual study. Women managed households according to religious law, dominated certain economic niches like moneylending and textile trading, and occasionally produced literary works despite limited educational opportunities. The Messianic movement around Sabbatai Zevi, 1626 to 1676, reveals the psychological impact of prolonged persecution and diaspora existence. Following massacres of Jews in Ukraine, 1648 to 1649, apocalyptic expectations intensified throughout Jewish communities. When Zevi proclaimed himself Messiah, thousands sold their possessions and prepared for imminent redemption. His subsequent conversion to Islam under Ottoman pressure created profound theological crisis, forcing followers to either abandon their beliefs or develop complex justifications. Hasidism transformed popular Jewish spirituality by emphasizing emotional connection to God through everyday activities. The movement's storytelling tradition conveyed complex theological concepts through accessible parables and tales of wonder-working rebbes. Hasidic melodies, niggunim, often adapted from surrounding folk traditions, created pathways to religious ecstasy without requiring textual learning. These innovations democratized spiritual experience in ways that continue to influence contemporary Jewish practice. The Vilna Gaon, 1720 to 1797, represented a different approach to Jewish revitalization. This Lithuanian scholar combined mastery of traditional texts with interest in mathematics, astronomy, and geography. He opposed Hasidism as emotionally excessive but shared its concern for authentic religious experience. His disciples established influential educational institutions emphasizing analytical Talmud study, the Lithuanian method, that remain influential in contemporary Orthodox academies. Jewish emancipation in Western Europe created new possibilities and challenges. Entry into universities, professions, and civic institutions required cultural adaptation and often religious compromise. Synagogue reforms introduced vernacular prayers, choral music, and decorous behavior resembling Protestant worship. Family structures and gender roles shifted as Jews adopted middle-class European norms. These changes generated internal tensions between traditionalists and modernizers that continue to reverberate in contemporary Jewish life. The scientific study of Judaism, Wissenschaft des Judentums, emerged in 19th century Germany as scholars applied modern historical methods to Jewish texts and traditions. Figures like Leopold Zuns and Abraham Geiger sought to demonstrate Judaism's cultural value to European society while creating frameworks for religious reform based on historical development rather than timeless revelation. This approach generated controversy but established foundations for contemporary Jewish academic scholarship. East European Jewish life in the 19th century generated extraordinary cultural production despite political oppression and economic hardship. Yiddish literature blossomed with writers like Sholem Aleichem and I.L. Peretz creating works that portrayed shtetl life with both nostalgia and critical awareness. Political movements from socialism to Zionism attracted passionate followers. Religious innovation continued in both Hasidic courts and yeshivas, academies, developing new approaches to traditional texts. The mass migration of Eastern European Jews to America between 1881 and 1924 represented one of history's largest voluntary population transfers. Approximately 2.5 million Jews sought economic opportunity and political freedom, concentrated initially in urban centers like New York's Lower East Side. Their cultural adaptations, from journalism to theater, labor activism to small business entrepreneurship, created distinctive American Jewish subcultures that gradually integrated into broader society. Jewish participation in revolutionary movements, particularly in Russia, reflected both universalist ideals and responses to anti-Semitic oppression. Many Jewish socialists, Bundists, and communists believed class solidarity would transcend ethnic divisions and create societies where Jews could live as equals. These hopes proved tragically misplaced in the Soviet Union, where Jewish cultural autonomy was initially encouraged but later suppressed under Stalin, who increasingly embraced anti-Semitic policies. The development of Reform Judaism represents one of the most significant religious innovations in modern Jewish history. Beginning in early 19th century Germany and flourishing in America, Reform reimagined Judaism as a progressive religious tradition emphasizing ethical monotheism rather than traditional law and ritual. This approach, initially radical in its departures from tradition, created a framework allowing for Jewish identification without practices that seemed incompatible with modern life. Zionism encompassed diverse and sometimes contradictory visions. Cultural Zionists like Ahad Hayam emphasized revival of Hebrew culture and creating a spiritual center in Palestine. Socialist Zionists envisioned building a just society through collective settlements. Religious Zionists interpreted return to the land as fulfillment of divine promise. Political Zionists focused pragmatically on securing international recognition. These competing visions coexisted within the movement and continue to generate tension in contemporary Israeli politics. The early Zionist pioneers consciously reinvented Jewish identity, rejecting what they saw as the passivity and otherworldliness of diaspora Judaism. The new Hebrew would be physically strong, agriculturally productive, and militarily capable, a direct contrast to stereotypical images of the urban, scholarly diaspora Jew. This ideological transformation manifested in everything from physical education programs to the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language after centuries as primarily a liturgical and literary medium. The Holocaust represented not only physical destruction but attempted cultural obliteration. Beyond killing 6 million individuals, the Nazis systematically destroyed synagogues, schools, libraries, and research institutions that had taken centuries to develop. Particularly devastating was the annihilation of East European Jewry, the largest and culturally richest concentration of Jews in the world, whose distinctive Yiddish civilization virtually disappeared within a few years. Jewish responses to Holocaust memory have evolved over time. Initial silence and trauma gave way to testimonial imperatives, documenting what happened through memoirs, oral histories, museums, and educational programs. Theological responses ranged from rejection of traditional faith to assertions of renewed covenant. The centrality of Holocaust consciousness in contemporary Jewish identity raises questions about constructing collective memory around catastrophe rather than cultural achievement or religious affirmation. The establishment of Israel in 1948 represented a revolutionary transformation in Jewish political existence. After nearly 2 millennia of minority status dependent on others' toleration, Jews created a sovereign state with military capacity for self-defense. This transition generated complex psychological adjustments and ethical dilemmas as a people long accustomed to political marginality suddenly exercised power, including over a Palestinian minority within the new state's borders. Israel's law of return, granting automatic citizenship to any Jew, embodies the state's dual identity as both liberal democracy and specifically Jewish national home. This policy facilitated mass immigration of Holocaust survivors, Middle Eastern Jews fleeing Arab nationalism, Soviet Jews escaping anti-Semitism, and others seeking refuge or religious fulfillment. The resulting society combines remarkable diversity with ongoing debates about the nature of Jewish identity and who qualifies for inclusion. The liberation of Jerusalem's Old City during the 1967 Six-Day War generated profound emotional and religious responses that transformed Israeli society and diaspora Jewish consciousness. Access to the Western Wall, Judaism's holiest prayer site, after 19 years of Jordanian exclusion sparked religious revival movements. Control over biblical territories in the West Bank intensified religious nationalist sentiments that would eventually manifest in the settlement movement and deepening political divisions. Contemporary Israeli society reflects ongoing tension between secular and religious visions of Jewish statehood. Questions of Sabbath observance in public spaces, recognition of non-Orthodox religious movements, military service exemptions for ultra-Orthodox students, and civil marriage for those unable or unwilling to marry through the rabbinate generate intense political conflict. These controversies reflect competing interpretations of what it means for Israel to function as a Jewish state in a modern democratic context. American Judaism in the late 20th and early 21st centuries experienced both institutional decline and creative fermentation. Synagogue affiliation and traditional organizational membership decreased, while interest in spirituality, social justice activism, cultural expressions, and alternative community structures flourished. The high intermarriage rate, exceeding 50% in recent decades, sparked concerns about continuity, but also led to more inclusive approaches to conversion and interfaith families. The feminist revolution transformed Judaism across denominations. Women's ordination as rabbis, beginning with Reform in 1972 and eventually including conservative and modern Orthodox movements, altered religious leadership. Feminist scholars reinterpreted traditional texts, recovered neglected women's history, and created new rituals addressing female experience. Egalitarian prayer, gender-inclusive language, and attention to women's perspectives have significantly reshaped contemporary Jewish practice. LGBT+ inclusion represents another dimension of contemporary Jewish evolution. From Reform responsa affirming same-sex relationships in the 1990s to the gradual emergence of openly gay and transgender rabbis across denominations, religious frameworks have increasingly accommodated gender and sexual diversity. These developments generate ongoing tension with traditional text interpretations while reflecting Judaism's adaptive capacity and ethical commitment to human dignity. The post-Soviet era witnessed remarkable revival of Jewish life in regions where communism had suppressed religious expression for generations. Synagogues reopened, schools were established, rabbis trained, and communities reconstituted, often with significant support from international Jewish organizations and Chabad Lubavitch outreach efforts. This renaissance, though serving populations much smaller than pre-Holocaust communities, represents Judaism's resilience and regenerative capacity after extreme disruption. The global distribution of Jewish population has shifted dramatically over the past century. In 1900, Eastern Europe contained the world's largest Jewish population. Today, approximately 80% of Jews live in Israel and North America. European Jewry, decimated by the Holocaust, faces renewed concerns about anti-Semitism and questions of cultural viability given small numbers. Growing communities in Australia, South Africa, and Latin America maintain distinctive traditions reflecting their particular historical experiences. Digital technology has transformed Jewish learning, community formation, and religious practice. Online resources make previously inaccessible texts available to anyone with internet access. Virtual communities connect isolated individuals and specialized interest groups. Pandemic conditions accelerated adoption of streamed services and online educational programs. These developments raise questions about authenticity, authority, and the nature of community while expanding access to Jewish engagement beyond traditional institutional frameworks. Archaeological discoveries continue to enhance our understanding of Jewish history. The excavation of Herodian Jerusalem, Masada, Qumran, ancient synagogues, and Second Temple period villages provides tangible connections to pivotal eras. Inscription evidence like the Tel Dan stele, mentioning the House of David, and Merneptah stele, containing the earliest non-biblical reference to Israel, offer crucial external confirmation of biblical narratives, though often with chronological and interpretive complications. Genetic studies present intriguing insights into Jewish population history while raising complex questions about the relationship between biological ancestry and cultural identity. Research indicates that many Jewish populations share some common Middle Eastern genetic markers despite centuries of geographic separation, suggesting partial common ancestry. However, significant genetic contributions from host populations demonstrate the oversimplification of viewing Jews as a purely endogamous group with unbroken lineage from ancient Israel. The Khazar theory, proposing that Ashkenazi Jews descended primarily from a converted Turkic kingdom rather than ancient Israelites, exemplifies controversies at the intersection of genetics, history, and identity politics. Though largely rejected by mainstream scholarship and genetic evidence, this theory periodically resurfaces in both anti-Semitic contexts, denying Jewish connection to the Middle East, and occasionally in Jewish sources, emphasizing Judaism's universalist potential rather than ethnic exclusivity. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish traditions have gained increased recognition after decades of marginalization in Israeli society and Western Jewish scholarship. Cultural expressions from music to cuisine, distinctive religious customs, and philosophical approaches from Judeo-Arabic and Mediterranean traditions increasingly influence contemporary Jewish life. This reintegration of traditions that developed under Islamic rather than Christian cultural influence enriches Jewish diversity while addressing historical imbalances. The relationship between Judaism and Zionism remains complex and sometimes contentious. While most contemporary Jews support Israel's existence, significant disagreements persist about Israeli policies, particularly regarding settlements, Palestinian rights, and religious pluralism. Anti-Zionist positions exist on both religious grounds, among some ultra-Orthodox groups viewing Jewish sovereignty as premature before Messianic redemption, and secular progressive perspectives emphasizing universal human rights concerns. Small Jewish communities persist in unexpected places, from Cuba to India, Iran to Morocco, often maintaining distinctive traditions despite dwindling numbers. The Abu-Udaya of Uganda, Beta Israel of Ethiopia, Bnei Minashi of northeastern India, and other communities that adopted Jewish practices outside mainstream historical development challenge conventional definitions of Jewish identity, while demonstrating Judaism's continued appeal beyond its traditional demographic boundaries. Contemporary anti-Semitism manifests in multiple, sometimes contradictory forms. Far-right variants emphasize racial theories, conspiracy allegations, and Holocaust denial. Left-wing expressions sometimes conflate criticism of Israel with attacks on Jews collectively. Islamist anti-Semitism combines religious antipathy with anti-Zionism and conspiracy theories. Online platforms accelerate the spread of anti-Semitic content while creating new challenges for monitoring and response. The concept of Jewish peoplehood, collective identity transcending religious observance, nationality, or political viewpoint, remains powerful despite centrifugal forces. This sense of shared destiny and responsibility manifests in philanthropy supporting Jewish communities worldwide, advocacy opposing anti-Semitism, and emotional connection to fellow Jews despite profound differences. Whether based in religious covenant, historical experience, or cultural affinity, this consciousness of interconnection remains central to Jewish continuity. The recovery of Hebrew as a living language represents one of nationalism's most successful linguistic revivals. When Eliezer ben Yehuda began advocating for Hebrew revival in the late 19th century, the language functioned primarily for prayer and scholarly writing rather than daily communication. Through dedicated efforts, creating new vocabulary, establishing Hebrew-speaking households and schools, and eventually making Hebrew the official language of Jewish settlement in Palestine, a seemingly impossible linguistic resurrection was achieved. Contemporary Jewish religious thought engages with modern challenges from diverse perspectives. Post-Holocaust theology questions traditional conceptions of divine action in history. Feminist approaches reinterpret patriarchal textual traditions. Eco-Judaism connects ancient agricultural laws with contemporary environmental concerns. Process theology, inspired by philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, reimagines divine nature in ways addressing modern scientific understandings. These diverse approaches demonstrate Judaism's continued theological vitality and adaptive capacity. Jewish mysticism has experienced remarkable revival in recent decades after periods of marginalization by rationalist and modernizing movements. Academic study of Kabbalah, once considered esoteric and inaccessible, now flourishes in secular universities. Hasidic approaches to spirituality influence meditation practices and emotional expression across denominational boundaries. Neo-Kabbalistic interpretations provide frameworks for addressing contemporary psychological and social concerns while maintaining connection to traditional sources. Jewish humor, with its characteristic self-deprecation, ironic perspective, wordplay, and response to adversity, represents a distinctive cultural contribution and psychological coping mechanism. From Yiddish folk humor to contemporary stand-up comedy, this tradition employs laughter as resistance against oppression, questioning of authority, and means of community bonding. The prevalence of Jewish figures in American comedy reflects both cultural values prioritizing verbal agility and historical experiences requiring resilience through reframing hardship. The concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, has evolved from an esoteric Kabbalistic concept involving cosmic restoration to a central principle motivating Jewish social justice activism. While some critics view this evolution as selective secularization of religious tradition, others see it as creative reinterpretation maintaining Judaism's prophetic ethical imperative in contemporary context. This principle has inspired Jewish involvement in movements for civil rights, economic justice, environmentalism, and human rights advocacy. Jewish diaspora homeland relations have evolved through several phases since Israel's establishment. Initial uncritical support gave way to more complex engagement following the 1967 and 1973 wars. Recent decades have seen increasing diaspora criticism of certain Israeli policies alongside continued emotional and philanthropic commitment. These tensions reflect divergent security concerns, religious expressions, and political values between communities developing in very different circumstances. Food practices serve as powerful markers of Jewish identity, memory, and adaptation. Ashkenazi cuisine, from challah to gefilte fish, brisket to matzo ball soup, reflects centuries of Eastern European environmental conditions and poverty. Sephardic and Middle Eastern Jewish cuisines incorporate Mediterranean and Middle Eastern ingredients and techniques. The annual Passover Seder, with its symbolic foods representing the Exodus narrative, exemplifies how culinary tradition transmits historical memory and theological concepts across generations. Contemporary Jews increasingly construct individualized identities, drawing selectively from tradition rather than accepting predetermined denominational packages. This à la carte Judaism combines elements of spirituality, cultural expression, ethical commitment, and community involvement according to personal preference. While religious traditionalists criticize this approach as diluting authentic practice, others view it as continuing Judaism's long-standing adaptive capacity and prioritizing meaningful engagement over rote conformity. Philanthropic giving remains a distinctive feature of Jewish communal life, reflecting both religious values and historical experiences. The tradition of tzedakah, righteous giving, historically supported community members in need through formalized collection and distribution systems. Contemporary Jewish philanthropy extends globally through organizations addressing poverty, healthcare, education, and disaster relief across religious and ethnic boundaries, while maintaining significant support for specifically Jewish causes. The question of Jewish continuity, ensuring cultural and religious transmission to future generations, preoccupies contemporary communal leadership. Declining birth rates, intermarriage, assimilation pressures, and institutional disaffiliation challenge traditional continuity models. Various responses include investment in Jewish education, identity-building experiences like summer camps and Israel programs, outreach to interfaith families, and cultural programming engaging unaffiliated populations through art, music, and intellectual content rather than conventional religious frameworks. Biblical archaeology, once driven by desires to prove the Bible, has evolved into a sophisticated discipline examining ancient Israelite society through material remains. Evidence from sites like Megiddo, Hazor, and Jerusalem reveals complex patterns of settlement, cultural interaction, and religious practice that sometimes confirm biblical narratives but often present more nuanced pictures of ancient Israelite life than textual accounts alone. This archaeological record demonstrates both distinctive Israelite practices and cultural continuities with surrounding Canaanite society. Jewish historical experience challenges simplistic models of history as straightforward progress. The community has witnessed remarkable achievements followed by devastating losses, periods of integration followed by exclusion, intellectual flourishing amid political repression. This cyclical pattern taught cultural resilience, the ability to preserve core values while adapting to radically different environments. The resulting historical consciousness tends toward neither blind optimism nor fatalistic pessimism, but rather realistic assessment of vulnerability alongside determination to persist. Israel's religious landscape reflects global Jewish diversity compressed into a small geographic space. Jerusalem's neighborhoods contain Hasidic communities from Eastern Europe, Sephardic Jews maintaining Spanish traditions, Yemenite and Ethiopian immigrants preserving distinctive practices, and secular Israelis creating new expressions of cultural Judaism. This concentration generates both conflict and cross-fertilization as traditions that developed separately in diaspora now interact directly in shared territory. The Dead Sea, that strange, saline body of water marking the lowest point on Earth's surface, has witnessed much of Jewish history unfold along its shores. From the caves of Qumran, where sectarians preserved their sacred scrolls, to Masada's plateau, where zealots made their last stand against Rome. From ancient Ein Gedi, where David allegedly hid from King Saul, to modern Israeli vacation resorts. This otherworldly landscape connects contemporary visitors to ancient narratives through tangible geography. Jerusalem's Western Wall, last remnant of the Second Temple complex, functions as Judaism's most sacred prayer site and powerful symbol of historical continuity. For centuries, Jews forbidden from living in Jerusalem made pilgrimage to these massive limestone blocks to mourn the temple's destruction. Today, millions visit annually, inserting written prayers between the stones while participating in worship that connects them to countless predecessors who stood on the same ground across 2 millennia. Time itself takes distinctive form in Jewish experience through the sacred calendar. Weekly Sabbath observance creates regular disengagement from productive activity for spiritual renewal. Annual festivals mark agricultural cycles and historical events, creating recurring opportunities to relive foundational narratives. The lunar solar calendar system, requiring periodic adjustment to keep seasonal festivals aligned with their appropriate seasons, demonstrates practical accommodation to astronomical reality within religious framework. Jewish textual tradition places remarkable emphasis on interpretive disagreement rather than dogmatic certainty. The Talmud preserves minority opinions alongside majority rulings, often without definitively resolving disputes. This approach reflects belief that multiple legitimate understandings can emerge from sacred text, that truth emerges through dialectical exchange rather than singular authority, and that interpretive diversity strengthens rather than weakens tradition. This model offers insights for contemporary pluralistic societies navigating different truth claims. The destruction of European Jewish civilization in the Holocaust represented not only demographic catastrophe but cultural devastation. Entire linguistic worlds vanished as Yiddish-speaking communities were obliterated. Centuries of accumulated wisdom embodied in religious leaders and teachers disappeared without transmission to new generations. Libraries, archives, and artistic treasures were systematically destroyed. This cultural genocide, beyond the horrific human toll, created ruptures in transmission that continue to affect contemporary Jewish experience. Jewish literary production spans remarkable linguistic diversity. Biblical Hebrew and Aramaic gave way to Judeo-Greek, Judeo-Persian, Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, and Yiddish as Jews adopted and adapted languages from their surrounding environments while maintaining distinctive alphabets, syntax, and vocabulary. In modern times, literary giants from Kafka to Bashevis Singer, Agnon to Oz, Ozick to Grossman have created works exploring Jewish themes across multiple languages, expanding world literature through distinctive perspectives drawn from Jewish experience. Music serves as a powerful vector of Jewish cultural transmission, from biblical cantillation patterns to synagogue liturgy, folk songs to concert compositions. Each community developed distinctive melodic traditions, Iraqi trills, Moroccan quarter tones, Eastern European modes, reflecting surrounding musical environments while maintaining certain common elements. Contemporary Jewish music encompasses everything from traditional prayer modes to klezmer revival, Israeli pop to Jewish jazz and hip-hop, demonstrating ongoing creative engagement with both tradition and innovation. Jewish architectural expression historically balanced adaptation to local building traditions with maintenance of distinctive requirements. Synagogues incorporated elements from surrounding cultures, Islamic arches in Middle Eastern communities, Gothic elements in medieval Europe, while organizing interior space according to worship requirements. This architectural flexibility reflected Judaism's capacity to maintain core practices while aesthetically integrating into diverse environments, necessity becoming virtue through creative adaptation. The Jewish bookshelf expanded dramatically in recent decades through recovery of women's voices, both historical and contemporary. Scholarly research has uncovered previously neglected sources, from medieval businesswomen's correspondence to early modern devotional literature written specifically for female audiences. Contemporary female scholars, rabbis, and writers have created liturgy, biblical interpretation, and theological frameworks incorporating women's experiences. These expansions represent not rejection of tradition, but its revitalization through broader participation. Hebrew Bible texts revealing divine engagement with humanity through historical process rather than timeless abstraction established patterns of meaning-making that continue to influence Jewish thought. Biblical narratives present flawed human actors, patriarchs who deceive, leaders who doubt, kings who fail, engaged with divine purpose despite their limitations. This theological approach emphasizes covenant relationship rather than metaphysical perfection, ethical response rather than mystical absorption, and historical redemption rather than escape from temporal existence. The patterns of Jewish history reveal consistent demographic movement, sometimes voluntary, often forced. From ancient Babylonian exile to medieval expulsions, from Spanish dispersal to Eastern European emigration, from Holocaust displacement to Middle Eastern Jewish exodus, geographic relocation repeatedly triggered cultural adaptation and religious innovation. These historical experiences created a tradition remarkably portable yet persistently coherent, capable of transplantation without dissolution. Contemporary Jewish identity increasingly reflects choices rather than circumstances. In open societies where anti-Semitism poses social discomfort rather than existential threat, Jewish identification requires affirmative decision rather than external imposition. Religious observance, cultural participation, and communal affiliation become voluntary expressions rather than inescapable conditions. This transition from ascribed to achieved identity creates both challenges of continuity and opportunities for meaningful engagement based on personal commitment rather than social constraint. Throughout their long and often turbulent history, the Jewish people have maintained extraordinary commitment to education, textual transmission, and intellectual development. From ancient scribal traditions to medieval academies, from yeshiva study to modern universities, learning has functioned not merely as practical skill acquisition but sacred obligation. This educational emphasis created communities that valued questioning, analysis, and interpretive skill, intellectual tools that proved valuable for both religious understanding and adaptation to changing circumstances. As our journey through Jewish history concludes, we find ourselves returning to those ancient inscriptions with which we began, characters carved in stone that still speak across millennia. The story we've traced reveals a people whose distinctiveness lies not in genetic isolation or territorial continuity, but in narrative persistence, the continuous reinterpretation of foundational stories to address new circumstances while maintaining connection to ancient covenantal commitments. This adaptive fidelity, balancing innovation with tradition, may represent Judaism's most significant contribution to human cultural evolution. Close your eyes. The dust of archaeological excavations is gone. You are in your room, surrounded by the gentle darkness as history's whispers fade into dreams. The ancient deserts and forgotten tombs dissolve into the shadows of your bedroom walls. The resilient spirit of a people who transformed catastrophe into renewal lingers in your thoughts as you drift toward sleep. Their story becomes part of your own consciousness, a testament to human perseverance across time. If you've enjoyed this journey through Jewish history, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Whispered Empires, and activate the bell notification to join us for future explorations of history's enduring enigmas.